Holy City Center Radio. It is episode number 201, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Monday, December 11th, 2023. What's up, everyone? I hope you had a great weekend, and I hope this week coming up is a good one for you as well. Not much to report as far as personal or anything really going on with the website. Nothing important to talk about at the moment anyway. So we'll just dive into the news because we got some big stories. As I mentioned on the last episode on Friday, I wanted to tackle this MUSC story. And after rereading the article from ProPublica, I've got plenty to talk about with that. We've also got an update on everyone's favorite local politician, Nancy Mace. And a headline that I think a lot of people didn't really pay attention to. I'll get to that in a moment. And then also we have an update on that situation involving a Mount Pleasant police officer who was hit by a vehicle on Friday night. So let's get into all of those stories right now. The Medical University of South Carolina, also known as MUSC, of course, initially said that it wouldn't be affected by a law banning use of state funds for treatment furthering the gender transition of children under 16. However, months later, it cut off that care to all trans minors. There's a lot to this story. It really encompasses a period in 2022, right in the middle of Dr. Annie Andrews, who, of course, worked at MUSC and was running for office against incumbent Nancy Mace in South Carolina's 1st District. So that gets intertwined here. And, of course, we were deep into the culture wars at this point around trans care, trans people, particularly accusations that, hospitals around the country were performing gender-affirming surgeries on children and the hullabaloo that caused, and, people calling in bomb threats to hospitals and all sorts of that kind of stuff was going on. So that's the time period we're in here. But how did MUSC get wrapped up in this whole, trans panic, basically, that was happening around that time? Well, there was a medical student by the name of Thomas Agostini who had won first place at a university-sponsored event for his graduate research on transgender pediatric patients. He had also been featured in a video on MUSC's website that highlighted, resources that the hospital system has that supported the LGBTQ plus community. So this study ended up catching the attention of some people and set off a political firestorm. Conservative activists specifically, they seized on this one line in particular, and you may remember this when Will Folks of Fitz News did a story about it, or when Nancy Mace retweeted the Fitz News tweet or story. I forget exactly how she posted it, and then she got involved. That one line that they really seized on was that the youngest transgender patient to visit MUSC's pediatric endocrinology clinic was 4 years old. Now, this study was just saying what ages. I mean, the study said several things, but in relation to this data point, it was talking about the age ranges of patients that they saw. That doesn't mean anything besides that. And yes, someone brought in a 4-year-old. The details of that are not in the study. It hasn't been released. So who knows exactly what that situation was. But in seeing that, activists, whether they thought they were doing something right or were just trying to drum up, some controversy when there wasn't any, inaccurately claimed that children that young were being prescribed hormones as part of gender transition. And of course, others were then saying that surgeries were being done on minors. Just because a 4-year-old was just seen in a clinic, that's all. None of this stuff happened. Now, okay, some local people put it out there, but it really took that next step when freaking Elon Musk, of course, amplified this false claim. He tweeted at the time, "Is it really true that 4-year-olds are receiving hormone treatment?" Yes, the classic, "I'm just asking questions." And asking questions that way, of course, people see that and just assume immediately that that's what's happening, that a 4-year-old was being given hormones for gender-affirming care. He did not care, nor did anybody else really care that No, they weren't, and that was pretty clear from the start. And this is completely just disingenuous or lazy, whether it was laziness because, I just believe the person who tweeted it and he didn't look into it himself, or if it's, I don't really care, I'm going to ask the question. So even if it's not true, it's going to bring up some negative attention because that's the end result. They don't care if the things they claim to care about. Oh, I don't care, if kids are confused about their gender, and they want to see a doctor, as long as they're not prescribed hormones or have surgery on. No, they want this shut down completely. So they don't care if it's true or not. So of course, when you have the head of Twitter tweeting that, and he's got, however many millions of followers, it gets amplified. It leads to people doing things like calling the hospital, emailing people, harassing people, etc. It also led to federal and state lawmakers asking, some of the top folks at MUSC whether this public hospital was in fact helping young children medically transition. Of course, as I've already stated, the hospital was not. Its pediatric transgender patients did not receive hormone therapy before puberty, nor does it offer surgical options to minors. Full stop. So at no point prior to this firestorm, and still is the case, no one under the age of 18 is having surgery for gender affirming care. It's just not happening there. Now, some under 18 are getting hormones for hormone therapy. However, as they stated, it did not happen until they started puberty. So, in other words, a 4-year-old is not getting hormone treatment. Now, people have beliefs about hormone treatments and the ages of people and all that, and that's all well and good. People can have those opinions. And, that little piece of information certainly didn't quell a lot of people who, think that that's wrong, and we're very vocal about it, whether online or, calling the hospital and things like that. But the point is that they weren't doing their hormone therapy before puberty, and they absolutely were not doing any surgeries on minors. So this should have been done as far as the initial claims, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter how many times the hospital said they weren't doing these things, how many times local media said it, people like myself who said it. It didn't matter because, again, the point was they don't care what's true and what's not. If there's any mention of trans care in any capacity, they just want it shut down. So, circling back, it had been 3 months since South Carolina's legislature at the time had banned the state's medical university, that's MUSC, of course, from using public money to provide any treatment that furthers the gender transition of children under 16. Before and after that directive went into effect, hospital leaders had told lawmakers and reporters that they didn't use state money to care for transgender patients, so they wouldn't be breaking the law, as they weren't even using those funds to begin with. And at the time, the chief of children's and women's care also said that the ban would not affect the services the hospital offered. Now, this is according to an email he sent to colleagues, which was among hundreds of MUSC emails that ProPublica obtained through a public records request. And they're the ones who wrote this story. And all the information I'm giving and passing along to you all is from them. Unfortunately, with Musk's tweet, all of a sudden there was some blowback and things changed pretty rapidly. In the months after that tweet, several things happened, including conservative lawmakers and activists, searching out for more information. MUSC employees were expressing concern that hospital leaders went too far to appease those lawmakers. Again, this is according to emails. And it also showed that the hospital leadership eventually buckled under the pressure, excluded doctors and other key employees from the decision-making process, and ultimately essentially they ended care for children, anyone under 18. So that included, by the beginning of December, that the hospital's leaders came to an agreement that MUSC would cut off access to hormones for gender transition for minors of all ages, including 16 and 17-year-olds, which went beyond what the legislature sought. The law was anyone under 16 couldn't have, public funds couldn't be used to further their care, transitioning care. So MUSC not only went back on what they said, they went even further than the law said, all because of this, pressure from let's be honest, a very vocal minority of people. Okay, there's that side of it, which stinks. but they also gave no public explanation of how providing the care to older teens could be considered illegal. So why were they stopping it? They didn't explain why they stopped it, and even worse than that, some transgender youth and their families found out that their care was no longer available well after the decision was made. The hospital didn't even contact these patients. Some of them didn't find out until they showed up for an appointment. So, in this story, there's a 17-year-old transgender patient whose name is Max. That didn't know until the spring that he'd been cut off from testosterone therapy after being on it for more than a year. And, of course, being on it for more than a year, Max had become, according to the article, more confident in his body and gender. They told ProPublica, I can't watch myself go back in time like that. I was like, I don't think I'm going to survive this. That's what he felt at the time. And that's what we're talking about here. When you cut off this type of care, and again, there can be age caps and all that stuff. Okay, I get that. But at 16 and 17 years old, they're having hormone therapy and it's making them feel better. It's because they are who they believe they are, and who they are, whoever they believe they are is who they are, of course. So by affirming their care and starting the transition process is a big deal. And a lot of, we already know that LGBTQ in general, but trans people especially, their rates of suicide are much higher than the general population because of course, they're unhappy. Maybe they feel like they can't be them true selves, whether it's at school, with family. They face harassment and hate from people, including lawmakers and people who should be better than that, and they aren't. And so it's clear that this type of care, it's been proven in different studies that it is helpful and increases and improves the mental health of the patients. So that's the human side of it, of course. Instead of just talking about this as, hey, this happened, this is cut off. That puts a human side to it, of course. Meanwhile, political hacks like Republican State Representative Thomas Beach, who is part of the so-called Freedom Caucus, of course, wants nothing. Doesn't actually want freedom for his constituents and people who aren't even his constituents, for that matter. He's one of the dummies who is online at the time making these ridiculous statements and pounding his chest about how he's pressuring the medical university to stop providing this care. Like, good for you, dude. Like, you're cutting off children from care they needed and wanted. Congratulations. He said a bunch of ridiculous things, including, quote, I went after the medical center of South Carolina with 19 other of my door-kicking, rock-ribbed, and South Carolina's most conservative legislator friends. It feels good to be a gangster, end quote. Yeah, bro, you're a gangster. Any gangsters notoriously say they're gangsters to help, make sure everybody knows. I would love to see if this guy ran into someone who was actually a gangster and how quick he would fold under that. Uh, all I can envision is this guy walking into a hospital trying to cut off medical care for anyone under 18. Like, I'm a gangster. Pew, pew, pew. Like, come on, bro. Like, so ridiculous. Uh, in addition to him saying dumb stuff like that, which of course riles up people, activists started calling the pediatric endocrinology clinic pretending to be parents of trans children, attempting to catch providers violating the clinic's own stated policies regarding gender affirming care. Trying to catch them in lies like, oh, the website says this, but you're really doing this. And so that doesn't seem like a huge deal, but it takes people away from work, whether it's an operator or a nurse or a doctor, whoever ends up being on that phone. It's taking them away from patients and providing actual care for people, not just trying to, get caught in, someone who's trying to get them caught in a lie and wasting their time. It's ridiculous. So in addition to that, that same lawmaker, Beach, uh, again went to social media and threatened MUSC's $188.9 million in state funds that they get. Now, that's 3.5% of the hospital's budget, by the way. It's, their budget's a lot bigger than that. But that's a lot of money, regardless if it's just quote unquote 3.5% of its budget. And in doing so, he also brought up some terms that a lot of people I see online using because they think it, well, number one, they think this is the be all end all of their argument. So he says, if MUSC is mutilating or castrating children, I won't stop until they are stripped of public funding. So again, putting aside the fact that none of that was happening at MUSC, those words, mutilating and castrating, you see a lot of people online when they're talking about why trans care for anyone under 18 is bad. They tend to say things like that. Oh, doctors are mutilating children. Why do you want children to be castrated? What's wrong with you? Stuff like that. And yeah, okay, if that were true, if children were being quote unquote mutilated or castrated, sure, okay, but it's not happening. I get the point. When they're using that term, they're saying the surgery is mutilating, but again, that's not what's happening. No one under 18 is having that surgery, and anyone over 18 who has that surgery is not being mutilated. The castrating thing also refers to hormone therapy, where there is a false belief that this is chemical castration. Because it's irreversible, but that's not actually the case. Multiple studies have shown that hormone therapy is reversible. It pauses puberty. If you stop taking the hormones, puberty will pick back up, however it was going to before the hormones treatment was started. So nothing is permanent. So no one is being chemically castrated. So again, they're using these words to drum up controversy and make it seem like things that aren't happening are happening. And again, it's not because they truly think, that stuff. I mean, I'm sure they do think that if that was happening, it's bad, obviously. But that's not what they want. They want the whole thing shut down, which is essentially what MUSC ended up doing. And so they got their way. And that's why they use terms like that to get people who may not be familiar with what the truth is to join their side. Now, our good friend Nancy Mace, of course, gets involved. She posts a video on social media attacking Annie Andrews, who was a pediatrician at MUSC at the time, and wasn't even connected to the endocrinology clinic. In that video, there was like white block letters over a photo of Andrews. It said, quote, sex change surgery, puberty blockers, gender changing hormones for children. That's not protection. That's child abuse, end quote. Again, not true as far as sex change surgery. And, yes, puberty blockers and gender changing hormones were used, but again, not until after puberty had started. And again, none of those things are permanent. So if their parents decided we don't want to do this treatment anymore, they could have stopped it, no problem. So again, just a lie furthering this fake controversy that was drummed up about things that weren't even happening. Andrews had to end up taking unpaid leave, and although no real details have come out about it, it was alluded to at the time that she felt threatened, whether it was people calling the hospital or maybe in her DMs or something. I don't know, but that was what it seemed like. It seemed like she was facing some sort of harassment, and this came shortly after the Must tweet and Nancy Mace's tweet. So again, just directly leading to getting these minions all whipped up, and then how it is when that happens, and all the horrible things that people say online get directed to a doctor and other people in that clinic. So Andrews ended up saying that she felt that MUSC had left her out on a limb after all this. She also said that MUSC leaders discouraged pediatric residents who wanted to send a letter to all hospital leaders defending Andrews against Mace's political attack. So they wouldn't even let something as simple as that happen. And so that whole mess is what led to them cutting off this care. MUSC leaders also repeatedly pulled back on any messaging related to LGBTQ plus issues, overriding the decisions of their LGBTQ plus health director, Chase Glenn, who is a transgender man and longtime activist here in Charleston. So they're basically handcuffing Glenn, not letting him do his job. And any kind of messaging that was put out there was muted or changed completely. For instance, there was a drastic edit to a social media post that Glenn had helped draft. He was forced to send it out completely changed. The tweet was about Transgender Day of Remembrance, which honors the memory of lives lost due to acts of anti-transgender violence. So it's not even advocating tweet. It's just we recognize those and remember those who lost their lives to violence. The resulting tweet barely, or post, I should say, barely mentioned transgender people at all on Transgender Day of Remembrance. That's how just afraid of this vocal minority that MUSC was. It's insane. So unsurprisingly, Glenn ends up resigning from MUSC. And can you blame him? Like, they're obviously not taking his role seriously. So that's the big story that I wanted to talk about. And there's a lot of things here. I'm very disappointed in MUSC. I used to work there. And, by and large, when it comes to care for their patients, I believe they do the right things. But I'm extremely disappointed that they caved to this pressure in a way that they went even further than what the pressure was, coming from. And now they left some patients completely in the lurch because they didn't even let them know. That's another, like, how could you not let your patients know what happened? They're finding out through media sources or hearing it from other people, or they show up for an appointment. Oh, you can't get your, testosterone anymore, like that story of Max I mentioned. So just they completely dropped the ball here. They bungled this completely and didn't stand up for their employees. And even worse, they didn't stand up for their patients. Obviously, Thomas Beach, Nancy Mace, Yahoo's spouting off nonsense online, furthering this controversy is another problem, and Elon Musk as well. Instead of finding out, okay, what is this truth here, we'll just throw out these accusations and we'll let our, gaggle of morons who follow us on social media, do the dirty work for us. The work of calling and harassing people who work there with questions, maybe harassing Annie Andrews because she works there and was running for office. And so, of course, shame on them as well. It's just a really sad realization that they went this far and will not be providing appropriate care for, people who need it. And again, I know everybody has different thoughts and opinions on this topic. From the extreme of there should be no care for trans children at all, to, okay, I'm okay with this type of care, but not this. This one's okay at this age. People have different opinions, but MUSC was not breaking any laws. The worst accusations against them were completely false, and they just went too far because of this dumb culture war. And again, it was just really, really disappointing to read that. I encourage you to read the whole article. Obviously, I just gave you a pretty big overview and spent the whole episode talking about this. But definitely go read it. There's more in there, including more conversations with patients and patients' family members who were affected by this, as well as some more insights into, some of the emails and things and what was happening behind the scenes. But as I said, just a disappointing story overall. Speaking of Nancy Mace, she is back in the news. Now, the headline, I think people just kind of read part of it, and the whole Schadenfreude, or however you pronounce it, I think got the better of people. And they didn't pay attention to what I think is vastly more important. So the headline from Daily Mail is Nancy Mace and her entrepreneur fiancé, Patrick Byrant, split after 18 months as staff quit her office and she's accused of discussing her sex life with aides. So that first part, that Mace and her fiancé apparently have broken up. I think a lot of people just saw that and just ran with it because they don't like Nancy Mace and, whatever. But that's not important. And I wouldn't have shared the story if that was it. Like, who cares? It's sad when there's breakups, and it sucks for both of them, I'm sure. And then you have like a, media outlet asking questions about it. Again, that's not the important part. It's that back half that staff, have been quitting. That's always an interesting story. But more importantly, that she's accused by some of those staff members of discussing her sex life with aides. And I know people hear that and like, who cares? People talk about their sex life all the time. And look, I get it. When it comes to sexual harassment, this isn't what people usually think of. It's usually, someone being physically touched. It's someone being, hit on. in a way that they are uncomfortable with or they or did not want. And people don't always think of this, but if you are discussing sex in any capacity, whether you are directly involving that person in your story, or saying what you want to do to someone or whatever, it's still sexual harassment if you're talking about your sex life in front of people if they don't want to hear about it. So again, I know some people on the scale of things might think, who cares? But she's a congressperson, and these staffers are her employees. She's the boss of her office. So it has another level of being inappropriate. And again, this is a situation where if the staffers don't want to hear that or they're uncomfortable with it, it's considered sexual harassment. And more importantly, someone in her position should know that and should know better. Now, again, I know some people, "Oh, who cares?" But look, it is what it is. It is sexual harassment. If they don't want to hear stories, no matter how benign the stories could be or how graphic they are, if they don't want to hear that, they don't have to be subjected to that. And that's sexual harassment. And if one of these staffers, instead of just going to the media, decides to make a formal complaint, she could be subjected to an ethics investigation. And that's the bigger story here. That's the point of all of this, is that she could have been doing these things. And, even if there is an ethics investigation, chances are there's not going to be any kind of penalty for her or anything. And so I get that too, that in the grand scheme of things, there's really not much that's going to come out of this, even if it moves forward. But it's still important. And, there were some people, a small amount of people who didn't understand why I was sharing this story on social media and thinking it was making a bigger deal out of something than it needed to be. But the vast majority of people got it, and knew why this is an important story. And yes, there were some who latched on to the whole she broke up with her fiance and they were just, basically celebrating in what they assume is her misery, which, okay, if that's what you want to do. But, you know, for me, it's not that, it's the rest of the story. And the story also mentions how 6 staffers have recently resigned and claim that she runs a toxic office, and that's related to her telling these stories about her sex life and also just her general behavior. And we've talked about that before. It's been reported about, some of the things she makes her staffers do and the requirements she has and how it's all about media attention for herself. So none of that is particularly new. But it is, again, could result back to the main point, which is that she's running an office that people seem to believe is toxic and are claiming, that she is, again, by law, it could be sexually harassing them by telling these stories that they don't want to hear. So something to keep an eye on. And again, I don't think even if it moves forward with an ethics investigation, which there has to be a formal complaint for that to even start, I don't think it's going to go anywhere major. But if it's happening, it should be looked at. And, she could have a little bit of trouble on her hands. Although, like I said, I highly doubt there being any significant penalty. I mean, we've seen what it takes to get people even considered to be kicked out of office and how it was so difficult to get someone like George Santos the boot. So, but again, I think it's an important story, and I hope people are paying more attention to that back half of the headline and less so on the breakup part. And lastly, the Mount Pleasant Police Department has identified Patrolman First Class Adam Blankenship as the officer that was struck by a vehicle on Friday night. He was hit around 6 p.m. after conducting a traffic stop, on Hungry Neck Boulevard and Venning Road. That traffic stop turned into a foot pursuit between the officer and the suspect. During that pursuit, Blankenship was struck by a vehicle and is hospitalized. No real updates outside of that. Hopefully, he is okay enough and will get through this and recover, fully and hopefully quickly on top of that. And I will certainly provide any updates as they come forward. But yes, that is the officer that was hit on Friday night. You probably saw that story. And so I just wanted to pass along the update. But again, hopefully he recovers quickly. And that'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. And, let me know what you think. You can always reach out to me via email, christian@holycitycenter.com, or on social media. And I appreciate those who have reached out before with questions, comments, compliments, suggestions. And I also appreciate you all listening. If you could, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. That helps get this podcast out to more folks. You can also go to patreon.com/Holy City Center to help out if you so choose. Lastly, I want to thank Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Sound System for producing this episode, and every episode for that matter, as well as Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every episode. Have a great start to your week. I will talk to you again on Wednesday. Good night and good luck.